Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. A front page story in today's Indian Express has revealed that 4 but possibly 8 young Indians from Mumbai have fought with ISIS in Iraq. It seems they were indoctrinated on the net and surreptitiously left their homes to join the Sunni insurgents. Is this the tip of an iceberg? And how should the government respond? That's the debate in part 2. But first, the Congress Party's opposition to the Modi government's bill amending TRAI so that Nripendra Mishra can continue as the Prime Minister's Principal Secretary. Is this based on principle, or is this just politics, or even possibly pettiness? The bill sailed through the Lok Sabha today, but its passage through the Rajya Sabha could be considerably more difficult. So is the Congress Party about to engineer the first serious setback for the Modi government? That's the debate in part 1. This auto cue is not working. And now joining me to discuss the Congress Party's stand on the TRA bill and its chances in the Rajya Sabha is Congress spokesperson Abhishek Singhvi, NCP Rajya Sabha MP Praful Patel, Aam Aadmi Party leader Prashant Bhushan, BJP spokesperson Shaina NC, and the former editor of The Hindu, Siddharth Vardarajan. Abhishek Singhvi, the Congress Party has taken a very strong stand in opposing the TRAI bill. What are your main reasons for opposing the amendment to this bill?
Karan, the issue is not at all our opposition, which may fail politically because of numbers. We are finding some volte-face today. The issue is much larger. This is within 2 days of a government taking office, a person-specific legislation brought in by ordinance. When we tried to bring in ordinances where the Supreme Court judgments had made a change scenario, there was a huge outcry about Ordinance Raj. Is Ordinance Raj to be used for a person-specific legislation? And this is a law which was passed with some rationale. TRAI was one of the earliest regulators.
Okay.
You parliamentary mandate, I have had a time, but to my recollection, this law was passed originally by the BJP. You pass a law where the whole idea is to create a Chinese wall between regulators and post-retirement or post-regulator job sinecures or jobs in the government. The reason is obvious. The question is a larger moral issue. Should you do it? Assume there was no act, Karan.
Okay.
Tomorrow you have some very independent adjudicator, let us say a judge in a lower court. Can he join your government after debating office as a judge? You frown upon it. There is no law which says so.
Let me on that point. Let me at that point of principle.
These are larger issues,
just a moment.
and therefore the whole object is you must establish standards.
Let me bring in Shaina NC and put to her that larger point of principle that you make. The point of principle, Shaina NC, is simply this: that you are actually breaching the Chinese wall that is essential to separate a functionary from, in fact, the allurement of some sort of offer from the government, which might then tempt him or her to take decisions that somehow were not right. That Chinese wall is essential to integrity and to good governance. You're breaching it. How do you account for that breach?
I think it's a very petty argument, Karanji, and please understand the BJP's point of view. Is the Prime Minister of this country, who has won a mandate which is historical to start with, not entitled to choose the principal secretary of his choice in the government that he runs? Is he not entitled to choose somebody of absolute repute and credibility, as has been Mr. Mishra's track record, which is obvious to the Congress itself? If the Congress is only going to play hurdle to prove a point, which is to say that, you are amending to suit your way, but what are we doing? We are proactively saying that if you want a good governance model, you need to have good bureaucrats,
okay.
You need to have people with impeccable repute, and you need to have people who have delivered. And we're not using the ordinance route to protect some thug or some corrupt politician.
You made your point.
Let's
not get polemical by bringing in thuggery. Let's keep it simple so that people can be analytical. Praful Patel, you're an ally of the Congress Party, and yet the National Congress Party has actually taken a very different stand to the Congress. Why?
No, listen, Karan, let me preface in the beginning by saying that we do not subscribe to ordinances as a matter of routine or as a matter of principle. However, in exceptional circumstances, if certain things like, this is not an ordinance which has some earth-shattering ramifications. Number one, as Shaina said, there's a Prime Minister of our country who's just been appointed, and he wants to choose his own team. So let it be so. The second part is there have been many other regulators besides TRAI which have different yardsticks where a regulator does not really have this kind of a restriction. And number three, Mr. Mishra has never worked with this Prime Minister, or I don't think, at least we don't believe that he has any past association with him. And therefore, a person of integrity, he's joining government at the end of the day. He's not taking up some private assignment. So, and the fourth thing, most importantly, is that we don't want to be just like, opposition for the sake of opposition. We'd rather be a constructive opposition.
Okay.
And we don't think that appointing Mr. Mishra has such ramifications that should, unsettle the whole system. We can look at it as an aberration, and as I said it earlier, we shouldn't adopt ordinances as a routine measure. Okay, this is not a very serious ordinance, therefore we consider it in a different light.
Prashant Bhushan, you've just heard Praful Patel argue quite eloquently that this is a one-off as far as they're concerned, and they also believe it's not a very serious measure. The Prime Minister's right to have the person of his choice as his principal secretary being the dominant consideration. Your party takes a very different view. You're a lot closer to the Congress position. Very briefly, tell me, why is the Aam Aadmi Party taking such a strong stand on this issue?
Well, there was a basic rationale for this law, which is now sought to be amended by this ordinance. The rationale was that the TRAI needs to be independent of the government, and that independence is compromised if you allow the TRAI chairman to take up a post-retirement job with the government. Now that whole rationale is being sought to be done away with in order to, as these people say, appoint a gentleman of the choice of the Prime Minister. Now, is the Prime Minister entitled to have an unlimited choice? Can he choose a High Court judge or a Supreme Court judge to be his principal private secretary? Can he choose a criminal to be his principal private secretary? The other point that is being made by them is that he is a very honest man. Let me read out the Supreme Court's observations about Mr. Mishra in the 2G judgment, about which briefly. The BJP stalled Parliament for 2 months.
Briefly.
This is the observation of the Supreme Court. While it cannot be denied that TRAI is an expert body assigned with important functions, it cannot make recommendations overlooking the basic constitutional postulates and established principles, and make recommendations which would deny people from participating in the distribution of national wealth and benefit a handful of persons. Therefore, even though the scope of judicial review is limited in such matters, keeping in view the facts which have been brought to the notice of the court, that the mechanisms evolved by TRAI for allocation of spectrum and the methodology adopted by the Minister Raja and the officers of DOT for grant of UAS licenses may have caused huge loss to the nation. We have no hesitation in recording a finding that the recommendations made by TRAI were flawed in many respects, and implementation thereof by the DOT resulted in gross violation of the objectives.
Let's not hijack the program by a long quotation from the Supreme Court. I take your point. You're saying that in fact the Supreme Court passed strictures against TRAI when Mr. Mishra was the head of TRAI. Let me focus, Siddharth Varadarajan, on the many reasons that people have mentioned for opposing this amendment of the TRAI Act, one by one, because I think it's important that we take them one by one rather than all together so audiences understand. Now, the first is that the amendment is happening with just one individual in mind, and that is a clear breach of the well-established convention. The laws are never made to either assist or debar a single individual. Given that the prime beneficiary in the first instance will be Nripendra Mishra, do you believe that this is a law being amended with one individual, or is that an unfair way of seeing it?
It is being amended for one individual, but I think the ramifications extend well beyond one individual in the following sense. That the government is sending a message out to all people who are meant to perform an independent regulatory function in this country, that if you play ball with us, there is no limit to the legislative changes that we are prepared to bring in order to facilitate your future employment or future perquisites or future benefits.
All right, you believe?
So I think that on the second day in office, for the government to send that kind of message, I think is something that goes well beyond benefiting just Nripendra Mishra, who at the end of the day, I don't want to make this a discussion about him, because he is a well-regarded.
Forgive me. I will come to the wider point you make, but in the first instance, this is a discussion about Nripendra Mishra. China NC, I'm going to stick to that first point, that this is a law being amended with just one person in mind before I come to the so-called message the government is sending out. Now, Ravi Shankar Prasad has gone on record to say that this amendment is happening to bring TRAI in line with the Competition Commission. But the law that sets up the petroleum regulator has a similar condition debarring further government employment for life. Yet that law is not being amended. So if you're only changing TRAI to bring it in line with the Competition Commission, but not the petroleum regulator, can you deny that you're changing TRAI specifically because it affects Nripendra Mishra? That, in a sense, proves the point, doesn't it?
Well, I won't completely deny your argument, but I don't say that this is going to be the only amendment which is made and no further amendments. And just to put this debate completely into perspective, what are we saying? That you are targeting a certain individual who has had an amazing track record, despite what Mr. Bhushan may cherry pick and read in a statement, and at the behest of the Prime Minister of this country, who wants to have his systems in place and comfortably work with bureaucrats who have been absolute performers. There is no conflict of interest because he is not going to be working on departments that he has dealt with earlier. And contrary to what Mr. Bhushan says, they believe that everyone they choose to put their hand on is completely a man of integrity, and anybody that anyone else wants to shield, protect or encourage based purely on merit is questionable.
But
so that is not something that we are going to stand by.
Can I stop you? I want to compliment you for beginning your answer by conceding that there's a very real, credible sense in which this is an amendment happening with just one man in mind, and that is not a point that Ravi Shankar Prasad has ever conceded. You've been good enough to concede it. Let me put the opposite to you, Abhishek Singhvi. The truth is that Nripendra Mishra retired as head of TRAI 5 years ago. So even if the law is actually being amended with just him in mind, why is that such a terrible thing? After all, the PM wants him as principal secretary. He's clearly deserving of the post. You're not contesting that at any point of time. So if the law is being amended with him in mind so that he can become principal secretary and that benefits the country, why is that such a terrible thing?
Going to make person-specific arguments, Karan, just like they have made person-specific legislation. The new Prime Minister within 2 days could find only one person in the whole country with the requisite talent, with the requisite punch, with the requisite reliability to be his principal secretary, who had to be passed by a new legislation. What a bankruptcy we have of talent as far as he is concerned. Thirdly, very importantly, there is a method to the madness, Karan. There are distinguishing features: spectrum, petroleum resources, mining resources. Tomorrow you may have a mining regulator. These are all national resources, largesse. They require regulators of absolute impeccable distance who have no possible, even a dream of future allurement or entrapment, as opposed to Competition Commission or SEBI. They are regulators of a different kind. These people, the spectrum man and the petroleum man, are distributing largesse. And there is a method to the madness. Now, today, look at what Varadarajan said, Siddharth Varadarajan. The message tomorrow is, forget all this. You have the normal rule of a 2-year cooling off period for bureaucrats. So, individually, I will make an amendment in a particular case for a particular bureaucrat. Then there is no end to it.
All right.
Because I am the Prime Minister, I have 286 and 333.
282
Nobody is
actually.
disputing. I am sure the legislation will be passed
All right.
in the Rajya Sabha.
Let me
But
stop.
that's not the point at all.
Let me stop you there.
You
I
may
want to
pass the
see whether
legislation, but
I want to
that's
see
not
whether
principle.
your eloquent answer actually has any impact on your ally who's sitting there listening to you. Praful Patel, what about that particular concern made by both Mr. Singhvi and Mr. Vardarajan that in fact the message you're sending out is that it doesn't really require future regulators to be independent and objective. Hereafter, you're almost giving an incentive to future regulators to take decisions that are tailor-made to support the government in the hope that they could be rewarded with a job thereafter.
But that's exactly what I said in the beginning, that we don't encourage such kind of ordinances, but as a one-off instance, a new Prime Minister has come in. What are we doing? We're just going to oppose for the sake of opposition? And the second part is, Mr. Mishra has never worked with Mr. Modi ever in the past. He's got an impeccable track record. Whatever may be other arguments which Mr. Bhushan and others have made, we are simplifying the whole thing rather than getting into too much of argument. Of course, Mr. Vardarajan and Mr. Singhvi have made a very eloquent point, so has Mr. Bhushan. But the fact is, the point is, you know, are we just going to come in the way of as an obstructionist just because we are in the opposition? I'm not saying that we should encourage and subscribe, but also the fact is that if TRAI chairman is being banned or barred after 5 years from taking up another government employment, then the entire gamut of all the regulators, including Competition Commission or others, we should all bring them to Parliament and we should rectify all of them, whichever way, whether we ban them, we allow them, whatever should be the thing,
can I interrupt
be uniform, and this should be used as an opportunity to bring in the requisite changes in legislation vis-a-vis all regulators.
That's a fair point, but can I interrupt you and put this to you? I get the clear impression from your answer that in fact you don't in principle like this amendment very much. You have certain qualms about it, but you're agreeing with it because you don't think it's worth thwarting the Prime Minister's wish to have the man of his choice as his principal secretary. For that reason, you're prepared to override your other concerns.
Karan, such a sweeping mandate somebody has got, and in the eyes of the people or in general, if you want to deny a person a choice of his own, I think it doesn't make much sense. I'm making it very simple. I'm not a lawyer. I'm neither trying to make very long argument about the overall legality of the whole thing. But the fact remains that yes, he's chosen him. He's passed an ordinance, and at the end of the day, of course, he's thrown the ball in the court of Parliament. But at the end, we all have to acknowledge that it is too early in the day to just oppose for the sake of opposing. And this is not, according to us, a very important, ordinance which merits the entire opposition coming together just to stall or to defeat the government and to score a brownie point.
Let me bring in Prashant Bhushan.
We'll take on the government on much more important things as they evolve. Why should we get into these petty fights?
Just a moment. You also made a convincing argument, but it is an argument that actually hinges on the fact that at the end of the day, why annoy the Prime Minister on something as small as this? Prashant Bhushan, let me put the opposite to you. Even though the act is being amended, there will still be, even in the amended version, a 2-year cooling off period before future TRAI heads can either take up government employment or private sector employment. Why is a 2-year continuing cooling off period not sufficient?
No, because to my mind, actually, in this country, there are a large number of jobs which need to be independent of the government, such as Lokpal, CAG, CVC, the judiciary, these regulators and so on. For all these jobs, they should be permanently barred from taking up employment either with the government
can I interrupt?
or for any corporation whose cases they may have
Can I interrupt? You're making a point. You're making a point in terms of principle. Let me point out to you that the electricity regulator, the insurance regulator, the airports authority regulator, the pension fund authority, all four have just a 2-year cooling off period. And as far as the coal bill, and it's only a bill, it's not an act, mooted by the last government is concerned, it doesn't have any debarment in terms of taking up central or state government employment. So I come back. Why is a 2-year cooling off period not sufficient?
No, that's not sufficient in my view for maintaining the independence of the regulator. In fact, the CAG is barred for life. Similarly, judges are also barred for life. Therefore, these are offices which need to be fully insulated from the government.
Okay.
At any rate, you see, this was a well thought out amendment made in 2003 by the BJP government, which is now being sacrificed at this altar of convenience. Okay. I sympathize with Mr. Patel, who says that, look, we need to concede to the PM his requirement of having a person of his choice. Just the other day I received
just a moment. I think Praful Patel wants to quickly disagree. What are you disagreeing over, Praful Patel? And then I'll go to Shaina and see Siddharth Varadarajan.
No, I'm not conceding anything. Neither am I saying that we should please the Prime Minister on any issue. I just said that I simplified the thing by saying that we'd rather take it up with the government, to take on the government on many larger issues, one. And number two, all regulatory framework, whether it is of TRAI or others, can be brought on the same level by bringing it to Parliament and let Parliament comprehensively discuss and make all regulators at par with each other. That's
you made that point. Before I go back to Shaina and see, let me put this to Siddharth Varadarajan. Would your concerns about this amendment be substantially ameliorated if the cooling off period of 2 years, which is what the government proposes, were to be, say, extended to 3 or even 5?
No, I think the original provision in the TRAI Act and the Petroleum Regulator Act, which debars any future employment, is a sensible one, because let's not forget the government has so many levers anyway to control these regulators. They appoint the chairman.
So you're saying
to begin with, and in the case of TRAI,
an expanded cooling off period won't work. So an expanded cooling off period won't work for you, extending it from 2 to 3 or 5.
No, I'm saying it won't work, and what I would like to see ideally is a thorough review, as the House of Lords did in the UK. They've done it twice so far, where you review the functioning of your regulators and come up with proposals that will strengthen the autonomy and independence of regulators rather than compromising their autonomy, which is what we seem to be doing.
Let me go back to Shaina and see on that initial point of principle, and the point of principle is very simple, that if you do not have a debarment, then there is clearly a potential for a regulator to deliberately take decisions, no matter how subtly, that favor the government in the belief or in the hope that he or she will get a post-retirement job. That allurement, that potential is sufficient to undermine integrity and to throw into question decisions that he and she takes. Doesn't that principle matter to you?
Well, doesn't the question of credibility and repute of the officer also come into play? And just coming back to Mr. Bhushan's point,
I'm interrupting you. You may be right in saying that this particular officer is full of integrity. No one is questioning Mr. Mishra's integrity. But what happens to future officers who may not have the same integrity, but now will have the opportunity, because you've reduced the cooling off period to just 2 years, to deliberately favor the government in the hope that 2 years later they'll get a reward? That's the Chinese wall you're breaching.
No, but there is a system of checks and balances, and I don't think things like this go unnoticed in our country, and especially with not just a vigilant media but a vigilant society at large. Nobody is going to misuse their position of power and jeopardize their career and just treat it as a one-off. So I think that the question of credibility is as important as accountability. But just coming back very quickly to Mr. Bhushan's point, he said that, you have the NCP that is supporting. Please let me tell him on record, you have had Mayawati who has made a comment, you have had Mamta Banerjee who has on record said that the Prime Minister must be allowed to work with officers who he thinks can deliver, and he must be given a free hand. So we are very hopeful that in the Rajya Sabha there will be an absolute consensus.
Absolutely,
because the logic is very amply clear.
Let's not get into the numbers game in Rajya Sabha. You may well have actually won it today, depending upon the way people are coming out in support of the amendment, but that's a different issue. I'm not talking about who carries the day in terms of numbers. I'm talking about the principle behind it. Sometimes it's possible for the people who lose to be right. Brute majority doesn't always mean you're morally or legally right. Abhishek Singhvi, I'm going to broaden the discussion at that point. I'm going to raise an issue that in a sense was hidden, I won't say embedded, but hidden behind what Praful Patel was saying. And that is that many people believe, I don't know whether Mr. Patel suggested this, but many people believe that Congress is really only taking up this issue because you want a bit of leverage in the leader of opposition matter, perhaps you want a bit of leverage in the National Herald matter. That is not the principle that matters so much to you as the fact that this is a convenient tool to further your own interests, and you're using it because you know that perhaps if you exercise power here, you can get something back in return.
Karan, 1 minute before you let
I understand the sensationalist nature of your comment, and also it's unverifiable.
I'll come to you in a moment's time, Mr. Patel.
But that doesn't really mean anything, Karan.
I'll come to you in a moment's time.
This happened. Hello, Karan. Karan.
I have a situation where two people are talking together. Mr.
you
Patel,
hear
I'll
me?
come back to you in a moment's time. Let
Let me
Abhishek
make it
finish and
clear.
I'll come to you after that. Go ahead, Abhishek, quickly.
Let me answer your question, Karan, which sounds nice and sensationalist, but is of course without any basis and evidence. The LOP issue had not even fructified fully or in a proper manner when the ordinance issue came within a day or two. And we have been consistent in our opposition within 2 days of this government taking power, and we have continued to be so. Everything which happens in this country now, I don't think you can gauge our support or opposition on the basis of the LOP issue for you, not in the remotest possible manner, and we don't expect anything like that from the BJP. We don't want it, we don't desire it. We will oppose certain things, and we will extend a helping hand where we think that the principle is unexceptionable.
Praful Patel, you wanted to come in at that point and you were talking under Abhishek Singhvi, so you couldn't be heard.
No, because you questioned Abhishek because on the basis of whether there's an LOP trade-off between us and them. There is nothing like that. We fully support the Congress as far as the leader of opposition status is concerned. We believe that Parliament, even if the numbers of 10% are not with the Congress, it is in propriety and the larger spirit
I accept that point. I accept that point. Let's not get deflected by the LOP issue. I accept the point. Let me take this opportunity. Let me take this opportunity to put what I think is a possible infirmity in your position to you. You believe the Prime Minister has a right to choose whoever he wants as his principal secretary, and if it requires an amendment in the law to facilitate that, then so be it. It's not worth quarreling over the issue. But what do you say to people whom perhaps in return point out that if there are improprieties involved in the way Mr. Mishra was appointed to his job, this will lower his respect in the eyes of his own juniors? That members of the civil service may not say this to his face, but they will certainly feel it in their breasts and in their heads that this top man got the job not the right way. Won't that undermine Mr. Mishra? Mr. Patel?
Yeah, okay. No, I understand. On a larger principle, there is no question. As I said, I started by saying that it's not something which we should subscribe on a daily basis. But now, having taken that step so far, and the fact that Mr. Mishra has got an impeccable background, I think, let it be, so be it, and we continue to, take things on with the government on larger issues rather than quibble over these small issues again and again.
Very quickly, before I go to both Prashant Bhushan and Siddharth Vadrajan, I want to put one other situation to you, Abhishek Singhvi. In 2011, when Dr. Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister, he proposed in his Independence Day speech a law to govern regulators. And if that law had come to be, then you would have ended up undermining the very regulators today you say you want to defend, support and keep objective and independent. So I put it to you that when you criticize Mr. Modi, this is a classic case of the pot calling the kettle black. Mr. Singhvi?
No, not at all. The case we are talking of is a case where one gentleman, can you hear me, Karan?
I can indeed. Go ahead quickly.
Can you hear me, Karan?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Yes, where the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister chooses one Mr. X and amends the law through ordinance within 2 days. The law which was proposed during the UPA had no such features as wanting to strangulate regulators. It had a feature, it was only proposed, it never went through, where there would be a mega regulator for some regulators to coordinate to coordinate. And that would be really in the nature of coordination.
Yes, and
We are
that
talking
mega
of
regulator
absolute
might have been the
chalk and
government
cheese
itself, isn't
There
it?
is no
And that's
question
the
of
great
controlling
danger,
that
isn't
regulator.
it? Isn't that the great danger? This is what Dr. Manmohan Singh said on the
That was
occasion.
with specific
We have no
reference to the financial
legislation.
sector.
We have no legislation which will enable the monitoring of the work of these regulatory authorities and make them more accountable. Very interesting. Make regulators more accountable. Who to? The government, obviously.
Yes.
The government.
Please read the bill. No,
Absolutely,
Karan.
the government.
Karan, please read the bill. It makes it accountable to Parliament. Even CAG is accountable to Parliament.
And
EC is accountable to Parliament. And that bill itself
and if the
has
Parliament
provisions
is dominated
which
by
want to make regulators
parties, so you
accountable
become
to Parliament.
to that party. This is all very clever legalese to make sure that through
Well,
the back
I
route or
think-
the front you end up.
I don't think,
Let me-
no. I don't think any democratic institution can be unaccountable.
All right, let me bring
I
in
don't
very
think
quickly
any
Prashant Bhushan and then I'm going to go to
accountability
Siddharth
can be done in any
Varadarajan.
democratic
Prashant Bhushan, are you willing to accept that when this matter goes to the Rajya Sabha, where sadly your party isn't represented at all, your ability to influence people with your cogent arguments is going to completely fall flat?
Well, we don't know what will happen in the Rajya Sabha. We do know that these parties like NCP or Samajwadi Party or BSP or many other parties actually, or even the Congress, are so thoroughly compromised and so so fully ridden with all these corruption problems that it is easy to arm twist them. Look at this particular case. It was the UPA who used Mr. Mishra initially as TRAI chairman to give a convenient report which was contradicting what he had said earlier.
I'm going to stop you because I think we mustn't get into libel about Mr. Mishra. That wouldn't be fair. He's not on our show. He can't defend himself. We must be very careful, particularly you as a lawyer, that we don't do and say things that sound libelous. That would be unfair.
I'm just using the Supreme Court's observations.
Maybe, but the Supreme Court's observations, the Supreme Court's observations can be wrong. You know as a lawyer better than me that the Supreme Court is only final because it's the last stage, not because it's necessarily always right. So let's be careful. There are the honor of individuals who are not present involved. So let's not be very quickly. Siddharth Varadarajan, I'm going to end with this. Congress looks as if it's going to be isolated in the Rajya Sabha. The Samajwadi Party, the TMC, the BSP have all indicated they're going to be supporting the government. We don't know about the JDU, but it's quite possible that other than the left, the Congress may not have anyone on its side. If that turns out to be the case, how much of a setback will it be for Congress? A quick answer because we're horribly out of time.
Well, it's clear that the government is going to have its way in the Rajya Sabha. And I think the Congress, what it should try to do is to perhaps talk to parties like NCP, Trinamool, etc., that at least as a compromise, that there should be some undertaking by the government to have a thorough review of the functioning of India's regulators and to have some kind of a report, some kind of a select committee go into this and set uniform terms as far as possible that will guarantee the independence and autonomy of all regulators.
All right, that's going to have to be the last word of this particular half of the show.